There are children who announce their futures loudly, through declarations of ambition, through obvious exceptional talent, through the kind of precocious achievement that makes adults take notice and predict trajectories with confidence. And then there are children whose futures arrive quietly, almost invisibly, expressed through patterns of attention that only become meaningful in retrospect, through consistent small choices that don't register as significant until years later when the accumulated direction becomes undeniable. Lucas Meyer was 12 years old when his teacher first noticed something unusual about how he spent his time. Not unusual in ways that suggested problems requiring intervention, he wasn't disruptive or struggling academically or showing signs of the specific difficulties that trigger formal concern. Just unusual in the sense of being consistently different from his peers in ways that were subtle enough to escape casual observation but distinctive enough to register with someone who paid careful attention to the variations in how children engaged with their world. Maplewood Primary was a typical elementary school in a mid-sized city, serving a mixed neighborhood that included both working-class families and the early signs of gentrification that would transform the area over the following decades. The building itself was older, constructed in the 1950s, updated periodically but retaining the basic institutional character of post-war educational architecture. Long hallways with linoleum floors, classrooms with large windows and radiators that clanked during winter months, a gymnasium that doubled as auditorium, a playground with equipment that met current safety standards but that lacked the elaborate design of more affluent schools. Ms. Rebecca Hollis had been teaching 6th grade at Maplewood for 17 years when Lucas entered her classroom. She was 49 years old, had never married, had dedicated her adult life to the specific work of guiding children through that transitional year between elementary school's relative protection and middle school's more demanding social and academic environment. She'd taught perhaps 400 students over those 17 years, had watched them develop from children into adolescence, had tried to provide not just academic instruction but the kind of attentive presence that helped young people feel seen and valued during a developmental period when many struggled with exactly those feelings. Most of her students passed through her awareness in patterns she could generally predict: the academically gifted who would excel regardless of her intervention, the struggling students who needed additional support and patience, the socially confident who would navigate adolescence with relative ease, the socially awkward who would face more difficulty, the creative ones, the athletic ones, the ones whose futures seemed already partially determined by family circumstances or obvious talents, or the particular combinations of temperament and opportunity that shape trajectories before people are old enough to consciously choose their own directions. Lucas didn't fit cleanly into any of these categories. He was academically adequate, not exceptional, not struggling, just competently meeting the standard curriculum's requirements without particular distinction. He was quiet in class, not shy exactly, not unwilling to participate when called upon, just someone who didn't volunteer answers or seek attention or dominate classroom discussions the way some students did. He was socially peripheral, not bullied or excluded in ways that would require intervention, but not integrated into the various friendship groups and social hierarchies that organize children's relationships with each other, just someone who seemed comfortable operating on the margins, who ate lunch alone or with one or two other equally quiet students, who spent recess periods by himself rather than participating in the games and social dynamics that occupied most of his peers. What distinguished Lucas was what he did during unstructured time. While other students would socialize or play games or simply waste time in the various ways that children waste time, Lucas would draw. Not casually, not as occasional activity when he was bored, but consistently, with focused attention that suggested the drawing itself was intrinsically rewarding rather than just a way to fill time until something more interesting became available. And what he drew was unusual. Most 12-year-olds, when they draw, produce images that reflect the media they consume or the fantasies that occupy their developing identities: superheroes, cartoon characters, imaginary creatures, sports figures, fashion designs, abstract patterns. Lucas drew buildings, bridges, parks, street configurations, public spaces, infrastructure. Not in the way a child might draw their house or school, simplified representations with basic shapes and minimal detail. Lucas drew with careful attention to proportion, to perspective, to the relationship between structures and their environments. His drawings included details that shouldn't have been accessible to someone his age without specific instruction: how shadows fell based on implied light sources, how buildings related to streets and sidewalks and other buildings, how spaces accommodated the human activities they were designed for. Ms. Hollis first noticed this about 6 weeks into the school year, during a Friday afternoon art period when students were given free time to work on personal creative projects. Most of the class was socializing while nominally drawing or painting, using the period as opportunity for conversation more than serious creative work. Lucas was alone at his desk, working on what appeared to be a detailed rendering of a pedestrian plaza with benches, trees, a fountain, and surrounding buildings that created partial enclosure while maintaining sight lines to adjacent streets. She'd stood behind him for perhaps 2 minutes, watching him work, before he noticed her presence. He'd been using colored pencils to shade the plaza's paving pattern, creating subtle variations in tone that gave the flat surface visual texture and depth, working with a level of patience and attention that was remarkable for someone his age. "That's very detailed," she'd said, her tone neutral, not wanting to interrupt his concentration but wanting to acknowledge what she was observing. Lucas had looked up, slightly startled, as if he'd been so absorbed in the work that he'd lost awareness of his surroundings. "Thanks," he'd replied quietly, then returned his attention to the drawing, adding more small variations to the paving pattern. "What is it?" she'd asked. "A plaza," Lucas had said, still focused on his work rather than on the conversation. "With the fountain in the middle so people can hear water. And the benches angled so you can see other people but you're not directly facing them, so it doesn't feel uncomfortable to sit even if you're alone." The answer had been more specific than she'd expected. Not just a plaza, but an explanation of design choices, of considerations about how people would actually use the space, of attention to psychological comfort in public settings. This wasn't casual drawing, this was someone thinking systematically about how environments affected human experience and behavior. Over the following weeks, Ms. Hollis paid more attention to Lucas's drawings. He produced them constantly during any available time, before class started while other students socialized, during lunch periods, during recess when he'd find a quiet corner of the playground and work in a sketchbook he kept in his backpack. The drawings accumulated: pedestrian bridges spanning implied highways, park designs with carefully placed trees and playground equipment, residential buildings with balconies and ground floor retail, transit stops with weather protection and seating. The drawings were always functional rather than fantastical. They depicted places that could exist, that solved real problems, that made implicit arguments about how public space should be organized. A drawing of a school entrance would include covered bicycle parking and separated pedestrian and vehicle circulation. A drawing of a street intersection would show raised crosswalks and curb extensions that provided pedestrian safety. A drawing of a playground would position equipment to create distinct zones for different age groups while maintaining sight lines that allowed adult supervision. These weren't the drawings of someone fantasizing about becoming an architect in the vague way children often declare future careers without understanding what those careers actually involve. These were the drawings of someone who was already thinking like a designer, who was already observing the built environment around him and imagining how it could be different, who was developing a systematic way of seeing that would eventually, if he continued developing it, define his adult work and purpose. But at 12, none of this was obvious to Lucas himself or to most people around him. He was just a quiet kid who liked to draw. His parents, his mother worked as administrative assistant, his father was a mechanic, appreciated that he had an interest but didn't understand its significance, didn't recognize that what their son was developing was a particular way of engaging with the world that would eventually become his vocation. His peers largely ignored him, neither bullying nor befriending him, just allowing him to occupy his marginal social position without interference. Only Ms. Hollis saw something more. And what she saw wasn't potential for fame or exceptional achievement or any of the dramatic future outcomes that teachers sometimes project onto talented students. What she saw was someone who had found something that genuinely interested him, that held his attention, that he pursued not because adults encouraged it or because it brought social status but because it satisfied some internal need or curiosity that most children hadn't yet discovered in themselves. Near the end of the school year, Ms. Hollis assigned a project to her class: draw or write about what your future looks like. The assignment was designed to encourage imagination and self-reflection, to give children opportunity to articulate their aspirations even if those aspirations were vague or conventional or would inevitably change as they grew older and learned more about actual possibilities. The results were predictable. Many students drew themselves as wealthy, living in large houses, driving expensive cars, surrounded by material markers of success. Some drew themselves in specific careers they'd been exposed to: doctors, athletes, musicians, veterinarians. Some drew family scenes, themselves with future spouses and children. A few drew entirely fantastical scenarios that had more to do with media they consumed than with any realistic vision of adult life. Lucas submitted a single drawing. Not a self-portrait, not an image of himself in any particular role or setting. Just a carefully rendered image of a pedestrian bridge spanning a river, with trees on both banks, with bicycle lanes and walking paths, with residential buildings visible on one side and a school visible on the other. The drawing showed people using the bridge, small figures walking, cycling, sitting on benches along the bridge's viewing areas. And beneath the drawing, in Lucas's careful handwriting, so people don't have to choose between safety and distance. Ms. Hollis had stared at that drawing for a long time after collecting the class's projects. The other submissions were about the students themselves, what they wanted to be, what they wanted to have, how they wanted to be seen by others. Lucas's drawing wasn't about himself at all. It was about infrastructure, about civic design, about solving a problem he'd apparently noticed in how neighborhoods were connected or separated by physical barriers. It was about other people's needs rather than his own achievements. She'd kept that drawing, put it in a folder in her desk, then eventually took it home and placed it in a book where she kept a few other artifacts from students who'd particularly affected her over the years. Not because she thought Lucas would become famous or that the drawing would someday be valuable. Just because it represented something she found moving, a 12-year-old already thinking about how to make the world around him marginally better for other people, already imagining infrastructure as care made visible, already developing the particular form of attention that might eventually allow him to contribute something meaningful to the built environment that everyone navigated but few people thought about deliberately. Lucas attended middle school and then high school in the same general area, continuing to live with his parents in the modest house they rented in a neighborhood that was gradually changing around them. He was never a remarkable student in terms of grades, maintained AB average, performed adequately on standardized tests, met requirements without particular distinction. He participated in no sports, joined no clubs, accumulated no honors or awards or achievements that would appear on college applications as evidence of exceptional promise, but he continued drawing. His sketchbooks accumulated, spiral-bound notebooks filled with detailed renderings of pedestrian infrastructure, public transportation systems, housing configurations, park designs, street layouts. He'd walk or bike around the city, observing how spaces actually functioned, noting where infrastructure failed to serve people's needs, imagining how things could be designed differently. He noticed that certain bus stops had no weather protection, forcing people to wait in rain or harsh sun. He noticed that some neighborhoods had no safe routes for children to walk to school, requiring either dangerous street crossings or long detours. He noticed that new commercial development rarely included adequate bicycle parking, making it difficult for people to access businesses without cars. He noticed that public parks often lacked seating in shaded areas, making them uncomfortable to use during summer months. He noticed that sidewalks frequently had obstacles, utility poles, trash containers, overgrown vegetation, that created barriers for people with mobility limitations. All of these observations became drawings. Not complaints, not criticisms written as text, just alternative designs that addressed the problems he'd noticed. A bus stop with a covered waiting area, solar panels providing power for lighting and a small heated bench in winter. A neighborhood street design with raised crossings and traffic calming features that made walking safe for children. A commercial plaza with covered bicycle parking integrated into the building design. A park with shade structures and water features positioned to create comfortable sitting areas. A sidewalk configuration that maintained clear passage while accommodating street furniture and utilities. When it came time to apply to colleges, Lucas chose civil engineering programs at state universities he could afford with financial aid and part-time work. Not prestigious programs, not the kind of institutions that would guarantee career advantages or impressive credentials. Just solid programs that would teach him what he needed to know to do the work he wanted to do, design infrastructure that served public needs. He attended State University 3 hours from home, lived in modest off-campus housing, worked 20 hours weekly at campus facilities department, studied with the steady diligence that had always characterized his approach to academic requirements. He wasn't the most talented student in his engineering classes. Several of his peers had stronger mathematical abilities or more creative problem-solving skills or better communication capacities. But he was consistent, reliable, and he brought to his coursework a specific sense of purpose that many students lacked. He knew why he was studying civil engineering, not for career prestige or high salary, but because it was the technical foundation he needed to do work he'd been imagining since he was 12. His professors noted his particular interest in pedestrian infrastructure and public space design, areas that many civil engineering students found less interesting than large-scale projects like highways or bridges or water systems. But Lucas gravitated toward the small scale, toward the infrastructure that directly affected how people moved through their daily lives, toward the design decisions that made neighborhoods more or less livable for people without cars, toward the details that determined whether public space was welcoming or hostile. For his senior capstone project, he designed a pedestrian and bicycle bridge connecting two neighborhoods that were separated by a major arterial road. The design included not just the bridge structure itself but the approach paths, the lighting, the landscaping, the way it integrated with existing street networks, the way it accommodated different users, commuters, recreational cyclists, parents with strollers, elderly residents, children. The project wasn't flashy or innovative in ways that would attract attention, just thoughtfully designed infrastructure that solved a real problem in the city where the university was located. He graduated with decent grades, without honors or particular distinction. Several classmates went on to prestigious graduate programs or received job offers from major engineering firms. Lucas returned to his hometown, took a position with the city's public works department, started doing the unglamorous work of municipal infrastructure planning and design. Lucas worked for the city for 10 years before proposing the project that would eventually become the bridge Ms. Hollis recognized. Those 10 years were spent doing unremarkable but necessary work, reviewing development proposals to ensure they met infrastructure standards, coordinating with various departments about street maintenance and upgrades, responding to citizen complaints about sidewalk conditions and traffic safety, attending countless meetings about budget allocations and project priorities. It wasn't the kind of work that generated recognition or advancement or any of the markers of professional success that people typically pursue. It was bureaucratic, often frustrating, constrained by political considerations and budget limitations and the competing interests that made municipal governance complicated. Many of Lucas's colleagues saw the work as stepping stone to better positions elsewhere or as stable but uninspiring career that paid adequately while requiring limited personal investment. But Lucas approached it differently. He saw each project, however small, as opportunity to make some marginal improvement to how people experienced the built environment. A street repair project became chance to add better pedestrian crossings. A park renovation became opportunity to improve accessibility for people with disabilities. A transit stop upgrade became chance to add weather protection and comfortable seating. Not dramatic improvements, not transformational projects, just incremental changes that made things slightly better for people who use these spaces daily. He observed where infrastructure failed people. Noticed which neighborhoods had inadequate sidewalk networks, which bus routes had insufficient frequency, which streets created dangerous conditions for cyclists, which public spaces were uncomfortable or poorly maintained. He documented these observations, translated them into proposed projects, submitted them through the proper administrative channels, advocated for them in budget meetings when he was allowed to speak, which was rarely given his junior position in the departmental hierarchy. Most of his proposals were rejected or deferred indefinitely. Municipal budgets prioritized maintenance of existing infrastructure over improvements, political considerations favored projects in certain districts over others, bureaucratic inertia made any change difficult to implement. Lucas learned to accept these rejections without becoming cynical or bitter, learned to see the work as long-term effort where success would come occasionally rather than regularly, learned that persistence mattered more than any individual project's fate. And he continued drawing. After work, on weekends, during lunch breaks, he'd sketch designs for infrastructure projects he imagined for various locations around the city. Not as formal proposals, just as exploration, as thinking through drawing, as maintaining the practice that had always been how he processed his understanding of how spaces could function better. His apartment accumulated sketchbooks, just as his childhood bedroom had accumulated them years earlier. Different subject matter, more technically sophisticated, informed by professional training and experience, but same fundamental impulse, observing the world, noticing where it didn't serve people well, imagining alternatives. At 32, Lucas identified a problem that had persisted in the city for decades: two neighborhoods separated by a 6-lane arterial road that created significant barrier to pedestrian and bicycle movement. The neighborhoods had different demographics. One was predominantly low-income Latino families, the other was historically black working-class area that was beginning to experience displacement pressure from gentrification. Both neighborhoods were underserved by public transit and commercial amenities. Residents from either side who wanted to access jobs, schools, or services on the other side faced dangerous crossing conditions or significant detours using the few signalized intersections. The problem wasn't unknown. Residents had been complaining about it for years. Several pedestrian fatalities had occurred at this location. Various officials had promised to address it. But no solution had been implemented, partly because of cost, partly because the arterial road was maintained by the state rather than the city and coordination between jurisdictions was difficult, partly because the affected neighborhoods lacked political power to force action. Lucas spent several months developing a proposal for a pedestrian and bicycle bridge that would span the arterial road, connecting the neighborhoods with safe crossing infrastructure that would also serve as public space rather than just functional transportation infrastructure. The design included parks at either end, seating areas along the bridge itself, lighting that would make nighttime use comfortable, landscaping that would integrate the structure into its surroundings rather than making it feel like purely utilitarian engineering. He researched funding mechanisms, discovered a federal grant program for infrastructure serving disadvantaged communities, identified potential cost-sharing arrangements between city and state, documented the safety benefits and transportation equity advantages that would make the project appealing to various stakeholders. He prepared technical drawings, cost estimates, environmental impact assessments, all the documentation required to submit a formal proposal. His supervisor was skeptical, thought the project was too ambitious for someone at Lucas's position, worried about the political complications of coordinating multiple agencies, doubted that grant funding would materialize. But Lucas persisted, refined his proposal, eventually gained approval to present it to the City Council's Transportation Committee. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October, one of dozens of items on a long agenda, allocated 20 minutes for presentation and questions. Lucas printed copies of his materials, prepared a brief verbal summary, arrived early to set up his display boards in the council chambers. The room gradually filled with the usual attendees, council members, city staff, residents who'd come to comment on various agenda items, journalists from local media who covered municipal governance. And near the back of the room, looking small and somewhat out of place among the usual crowd, sat Ms. Rebecca Hollis. She'd been retired for 5 years, no longer teaching but remaining engaged with her community, attending city council meetings occasionally when topics interested her. She'd seen Lucas's name on the agenda, a name she'd never forgotten though she'd lost track of him after he'd moved on from her 6th grade classroom 20 years earlier, and had come out of curiosity to see what the quiet boy who'd drawn cities was doing now. When Lucas's turn came, he presented his proposal with the same quiet competence he'd always brought to his work. No dramatic rhetoric, no appeals to emotion, just clear explanation of the problem, detailed description of his proposed solution, careful documentation of costs and benefits and feasibility. He showed his technical drawings, elevations, plans, sections, details, and he showed renderings of how the completed bridge would look from various perspectives. Ms. Hollis recognized it immediately. Not because Lucas was presenting the exact drawing from 20 years earlier, the professional design was much more detailed, had been refined by 2 decades of learning and experience, incorporated technical requirements that a 12-year-old couldn't have understood. But the fundamental concept was identical, a pedestrian bridge connecting two neighborhoods separated by a barrier, designed not just as transportation infrastructure but as public space, as civic architecture that acknowledged and served the needs of people who didn't have cars, who needed safe ways to move through their environment, who deserved infrastructure that was designed with the same care that was typically reserved for wealthier areas. The caption beneath his childhood drawing had read, "So people don't have to choose between safety and distance." The adult proposal made the same argument, just in professional language with technical justification and budget documentation. Council members asked questions about cost, about maintenance responsibilities, about construction timeline, about coordination with state transportation department. Lucas answered each question carefully, demonstrating that he'd thought through the practical complications, that this wasn't an idealistic proposal from someone who didn't understand political and bureaucratic realities. He'd done the work of translating vision into implementable project, had addressed the objections that would inevitably arise, had made it as easy as possible for decision-makers to approve it. The committee voted to move the proposal forward to the full council. Not guaranteed approval, but significant progress, more than Lucas had expected for a first presentation. He gathered his materials, accepted congratulations from a few supportive committee members, began packing his display boards back into their carrying case. Ms. Hollis approached him as the room was emptying. She was 69 now, her hair entirely gray, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was aging but whose mind remained sharp. She'd been uncertain whether to say anything, hadn't wanted to insert herself into this moment, but something compelled her to make her presence known. "Mr. Meyer," she said quietly as he was organizing his materials. Lucas looked up, registered her face as familiar but couldn't immediately place where he knew her from. 20 years was a long time. People change, especially across the boundary between childhood and adulthood. But there was something in her expression, some quality of attention, that triggered recognition. "Ms. Hollis," he said, uncertain. "I taught you 6th grade, she confirmed. "At Maplewood Primary. 20 years ago." Lucas's expression shifted through several emotions, surprise, recognition, pleasure at an unexpected reunion. "Yes, I remember. You were," he paused, choosing words carefully. "You were kind. You paid attention. You drew constantly," Ms. Hollis said. "Buildings. Bridges. Spaces for people." "I still do," Lucas replied, gesturing at the display boards he'd just presented. "Apparently." They moved to a quieter area of the room, away from the remaining people still conversing. Ms. Hollis pulled a folder from her bag, opened it, removed a piece of paper that had been carefully preserved for 2 decades. She unfolded it and showed it to Lucas. It was his childhood drawing. The pedestrian bridge, the river, the neighborhoods on either side. The caption, "So people don't have to choose between safety and distance." Lucas stared at the drawing for a long moment, recognizing it as his own work but seeing it with the strange double perspective of being both the child who created it and the adult looking back at that child's thinking. He'd forgotten about this specific drawing, had created so many over the years that individual ones blurred together, but seeing it now, seeing the fundamental continuity between what he'd imagined at 12 and what he was proposing at 32, created a sense of his own life's trajectory that he'd never quite articulated before. "You kept this?" he asked quietly. "I did," Ms. Hollis confirmed. "I kept it because it was different from what other students drew. They drew futures for themselves. You drew a future for other people. A bridge so people wouldn't have to choose between safety and distance. That seemed important. Worth remembering." Lucas carefully refolded the drawing and handed it back to her. "Thank you," he said, and the gratitude was for more than just keeping the drawing. It was for the recognition itself, for someone having noticed, for the validation that what he'd been doing, then and now, had meaning beyond just his personal satisfaction, connected to something larger than individual achievement or career success. They talked for a few more minutes about what he'd been doing in the intervening years, about his work with the city, about his persistent focus on the kind of infrastructure that served people who were typically underserved by urban design. Then Ms. Hollis left, and Lucas finished packing his materials and drove home, thinking about the strange experience of encountering your childhood self through someone else's careful preservation of what you'd created before you understood what you were creating. The full city council approved Lucas's proposal 2 months later, allocating matching funds for the federal grant he'd identified. The state transportation department agreed to coordinate on the design and to maintain the bridge once constructed. The project moved into detailed design phase, then engineering, then contracting, then construction, the long slow process through which ideas become physical reality, through which drawings on paper transform into steel and concrete and asphalt and landscaping. Lucas managed the project through all these phases, attending community meetings to gather input from residents who would use the bridge, coordinating with contractors and subcontractors, making the thousands of small decisions required to translate a design into an actual built structure. He worked extra hours without additional compensation, not from martyrdom or excessive dedication but from simple desire to ensure the project was executed properly, that the final bridge would actually serve the purposes he'd imagined, that the care he'd invested in the design would translate into care evident in the constructed reality. Construction took 18 months. During that time, Lucas visited the site regularly, watching the foundation work, the structural steel erection, the deck construction, the railing installation, the approach path development, the landscaping. Watching an idea become real through accumulated labor of dozens of people, engineers and fabricators and construction workers and landscape architects and electricians and painters, all contributing their specialized knowledge to create something that would serve thousands of people who would never know any of their names, would never think about the human effort required to create the infrastructure they use daily. The bridge opened on a Saturday in June without ceremony or official ribbon cutting. The city hadn't allocated budget for formal opening event, this was just infrastructure, utilitarian public works, not the kind of project that warranted celebration. Lucas had mixed feelings about this. Part of him appreciated the absence of fanfare, the bridge would be judged by whether it served people's needs, not by how impressive it appeared at a ceremonial opening. But part of him also felt the community deserved some acknowledgement that this infrastructure had been created specifically for them, that their needs had been taken seriously enough to justify significant public investment. But ceremony or not, people began using the bridge immediately. Within the first hour of its opening, dozens of residents crossed it, parents with children, elderly people walking slowly and appreciating the seating areas along the bridge's length, teenagers on bicycles, commuters heading to bus stops or jobs on the opposite side. The pattern continued throughout the day, the bridge immediately integrating into neighborhood residents' mental maps of how to move through their environment, becoming infrastructure that was simultaneously new and also instantly familiar, as if it had always been there and people were just now noticing it for the first time. Lucas stood at one end of the bridge that afternoon, watching people use it, observing whether the design elements he'd incorporated were functioning as intended. The covered areas providing shade on a hot day, working as planned. The seating arranged to allow people to rest while maintaining awareness of others around them, creating comfortable stopping points without territorial conflicts. The lighting designed to make nighttime use feel safe, would need to verify after sunset. The landscaping creating green buffer between the bridge and the surrounding streets, successfully integrating the structure into its environment rather than making it feel like alien imposition. Ms. Hollis arrived in mid-afternoon, having heard about the bridge's opening through community networks, having wanted to see the completed project. She found Lucas standing near the bridge's entrance, notepad in hand, making notes about what he was observing. "You're documenting," she observed as she approached. Lucas looked up, smiled. "Learning. For next time. What works, what doesn't, what could be better." They walked across the bridge together, moving slowly, pausing at the viewing areas, watching other people use the space. A group of children ran past, laughing. Two elderly women sat on one of the benches, conversing in Spanish, clearly neighbors who could now easily visit each other without the dangers crossing. A man on a bicycle stopped to admire the view of the surrounding neighborhood from the bridge's midpoint. "Do you feel proud?" Ms. Hollis asked. Lucas considered the question. "Not proud exactly," he said after a pause. "More like, satisfied. Like something that should exist now exists. Like I did what I'm supposed to be doing." "That's pride," Ms. Hollis suggested gently. just quieter than how people usually experience it. They reached the opposite end of the bridge, stood looking back at the structure spanning the arterial road below, at the steady stream of people using it, at the two neighborhoods now connected by infrastructure that acknowledged and served their needs. "I kept drawing," Lucas said, continuing a conversation they'd begun months earlier when she'd shown him his childhood drawing. "After your class, all through middle school and high school and college and work. Just kept drawing the things I thought we needed. Most of them will never get built. That's fine. But this one did. And now people can use it. That's..." He struggled for words to express something he'd never quite articulated before. "That's enough." Ms. Hollis nodded. She understood what he meant, that he wasn't motivated by fame or recognition or the accumulation of impressive credentials. That he'd found something worth doing and had been doing it steadily for 20 years, not because it brought rewards but because it was what made sense to him, what felt like his appropriate contribution to the world that others would inhabit and benefit from without knowing his name or caring about his motivations. They walked back across the bridge together, then separated to return to their respective homes. Lucas would continue working for the city for many more years, would design other projects, would experience more rejections than approvals, would incrementally improve his city's infrastructure in ways that most people would never consciously notice but that would make daily life marginally easier for thousands of people. Would never become famous, would never accumulate wealth or status or power. Would just keep drawing places people needed and, when possible, helping to build them. Ms. Hollis would live another 8 years, would attend several more city council meetings when Lucas presented proposals, would watch him gradually become more confident in his presentations while maintaining the essential quiet competence that had always characterized his approach. Would eventually die having witnessed one of her students find his purpose and pursue it with the kind of persistent dedication that creates meaning even when it doesn't create acclaim. And the bridge would stand, would serve its neighborhoods, would accumulate its own history of use and meaning, would gradually fade from conscious awareness as infrastructure does when it works well, becoming simply part of the taken-for-granted background of how people move through their environment, how neighborhoods connect to each other, how care for public welfare manifests in steel and concrete and careful design choices that most people never think about but that shape experience. Nonetheless, pay attention to small visions. They often grow into something real. This is what Lucas's story teaches, not that childhood dreams always come true in literal ways, not that determination and persistence guarantee success, but that the particular quality of attention you bring to the world matters, that noticing what's missing or what could be better and then maintaining that noticing over decades can eventually translate into tangible improvements to how people experience their shared environment. Lucas didn't set out to become remarkable. Didn't seek fame or recognition or dramatic achievement. Just noticed, when he was 12, that infrastructure often didn't serve people well, that spaces were designed without sufficient care for how actual humans would move through them, that neighborhoods were separated by barriers that didn't need to be barriers, that design choices were made without considering the people most affected by those choices. And having noticed, he couldn't stop noticing. Couldn't accept the built environment as inevitable rather than as result of cumulative design decisions that could be made differently. This quality of attention, persistent, specific, focused on problems that affect people who typically lack power to demand solutions, defined his entire trajectory. Not in ways that made him special or exceptional. Just in ways that made him useful. That allowed him to contribute something meaningful over decades of steady, unglamorous work that most people would find insufficiently rewarding to sustain. The call to action here isn't to pursue some specific career path or to believe that childhood interests always predict adult vocations. It's something more fundamental, to notice what draws your attention, what problems or questions or possibilities you find yourself returning to repeatedly, what you care about not because caring brings rewards but because caring seems like appropriate response to what you're observing in the world around you. For Lucas, this was infrastructure, the physical arrangements that make places more or less livable for people without power or wealth. For others, it might be education, healthcare, environmental conservation, community organizing, artistic expression, technological development, or any of countless other domains where human attention and effort can create marginal improvements to how people experience their lives. The common element isn't the specific domain but the quality of attention, noticing what needs attention, maintaining that noticing over time, developing the skills and knowledge required to translate noticing into action, persisting through the inevitable rejections and setbacks and delays that characterize any effort to change anything about how the world functions. And accepting that most of this work won't bring recognition, won't result in fame or wealth or impressive credentials, will often be invisible to people who benefit from it, who will simply use the improved infrastructure or access the better services or experience the enhanced environment without knowing who created it or why. Will be visible primarily through its absence, through what doesn't happen because someone designed systems to prevent problems, through suffering that doesn't occur because someone created better alternatives, through possibilities that become available because someone noticed they weren't available and worked to change that. Lucas spent 20 years drawing what people needed before he built his first significant project. 20 years of persistent attention, of developing skills, of learning how systems work and how to navigate them, of accumulating the knowledge required to translate vision into implementable plan. 20 years during which he could have abandoned this particular focus, could have pursued more immediately rewarding paths, could have decided that infrastructure for underserved neighborhoods wasn't sufficiently important to justify the sustained effort and limited recognition it generated. But he didn't abandon it. Just kept drawing, kept working, kept noticing what needed to exist and imagining how to create it. And eventually, not inevitably, not guaranteed, but eventually, one of his drawings became real, became a bridge that served thousands of people who would never know his name but who could now move through their environment more safely and easily because he'd maintained his attention for 2 decades. That's the lesson. That's the call to action. Not that dreams come true if you believe hard enough or work hard enough, life's more complicated and arbitrary than that. But that sustained attention matters, that caring persistently about specific problems can eventually translate into tangible improvements, that purpose doesn't require acclaim or recognition to be legitimate or worthwhile. Notice what draws your attention. Notice what you care about. Notice what you keep returning to despite lack of immediate rewards. And if what you're noticing seems worth addressing, develop the skills and knowledge required to address it. Persist through the rejections and setbacks. Accept that most of your efforts won't produce dramatic visible results. Keep working anyway, because the work itself, the act of sustained attention to problems worth addressing, is itself meaningful regardless of what it ultimately produces. Lucas drew a bridge when he was 12. Built it when he was 32. Will draw and possibly build other infrastructure over his remaining career. Will never be famous, will never be wealthy, will never accumulate the markers of success that society typically celebrates. But will have created something useful, something that serves people who needed it, something that makes his city marginally better for thousands of residents who will never thank him because they'll never know he exists. That's enough. More than enough. That's what purpose looks like when it's pursued quietly, persistently, over decades. Pay attention to small visions. They often grow into something real. Be StoryWise.